Thank you so much for joining us for the launch of The Color of God with author Ayesha Chaudhry and Sarah Munawar. I'm Emily and I work with Massey Books and Massey Art Societies. We're pleased that you are joining us here today. The Color of God is available for purchase from Massey Books, which is an Indigenous-owned bookstore located on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. These lands are the site of many acts of resurgence, resistance, and beauty. Our storefront is located more precisely in Vancouver's Chinatown and adjacent to Hogan's Alleys, and these intersecting and entangled histories guide the work that we do. We take our lead from host nations' call to action and the chorus of voices who share through literature, art, and grassroots initiatives what collective paths forward may look like. We aim to keep our events free to our community and invite you, instead of a ticket price, we encourage you or invite you to donate, learn more, and share grassroots initiatives that relate to these territories or themes that will arrive through this evening's event. One such initiative is the Tsleil-Waututh Nation Sacred Trust, which is working hard to stop the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline through these lands and waters. I'll drop the link to the chat to learn more about the Sacred Trust initiative, as well as the link to purchase The Color of God. As mentioned, we do offer shipping across national and internationally, so we can get a book to find you. I'm so excited to introduce this evening's special guest, Sarah Munawar. Sarah Munawar is a Pakistani Muslim and settler living on and sustained by the stolen and unceded lands and waters of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia and is also a political science instructor at Columbia College. As a scholar, mother, and Muslim, she thinks, writes, and practices an intersectional and decolonial Islamic ethic of care that legitimizes care-based epistemologies of Islam and Islamic lineages of disability justice. As you can imagine, we're so excited to have Sarah here with us this evening, so I'll pass it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Emily, for the introduction. So before we begin, I also want to really acknowledge that this book launch and our dialogue today takes place on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We would also like to acknowledge that so many of you are joining today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. So this book launch is jam-packed. We have a full agenda. So before I begin, for those of you who are not familiar, I want to introduce the wonderful Dr. Ayesha Chaudhry. She's the Canada Research Chair in Religion, Law, and Social Justice, and is also an Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and Gender Studies at the University of British Columbia. So as an American Canadian, she was elected as a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada in 2019 and was named a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Fellow in 2018. She was a 2016 and 2017 Wall Scholar at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Study at UBC and the 2015-2016 Rita E. Hauser Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. She's the author of The Color of God, which we're discussing today, and also Domestic Violence and the Islamic Tradition, Ethics Law, and the Muslim Discourse and Gender. Dr. Chaudhry's research focuses on Islamic law and theology. So for our book launch today, this is the lineup. So first, Ayesha's going to do a reading for us from the book. Then we invite you to participate in a dialogue with us. And following the dialogue between Ayesha and I, we will have a question and answer period. And then after the question period, we're going to close the book launch with a prayer recited by Ayesha. So Ayesha, you can start your reading.
I want to thank Massey Books for hosting this launch, and I want to also thank Sarah Munawar for agreeing to be my interlocutor in this conversation. I'm really excited for our discussion today, and thank you to everybody who has shown up today as well to listen to us. So this piece I'm going to read is from a chapter in the book called Theft. And I'm going to read an excerpt from the chapter, so I won't be reading the whole chapter. And the chapter basically it begins with an incident with a hatchet, and the hatchet is used to teach a child a lesson about stealing. And many of us, parents, teachers, government officials use fear to teach people lessons. And so this is one of the things that the chapter is reflecting upon. I have only 2 memories of my grandfather, both from family trips to Pakistan. In one, he's in a bed in one of the rooms in my mamu's portion of the house. The room is painted a light shade of green. It is a house that my grandfather claimed after partition. He fled to Pakistan from India with his family, leaving behind farmlands, cattle, and a haveli, a compound of houses, immovable wealth. Apparently, the way it worked during partition was that if you survived the massacres in your hometown, escaped the knives of your neighbors, jewelers, butchers, and school teachers, once friends, now turned enemies based on lines drawn by white men over lunches in posh rooms. If you survived the violence along the way on the roads and train stations, stations turned for a little while into battlefields and slaughterhouses, running red with rivers of blood. If you finally made it to the place where you were supposed to be, which wasn't your home because that had been left behind, but the place where it had been decided by the people who would never be called thieves, that you'd have to start your life over, that what you would do is find that empty home, another displaced family's home, and move into it and claim it as your own. Finders keepers following partition, displacement, and massacre. The house my grandparents settled into is a large home that used to belong to a Punjabi Hindu or Sikh family. We know this because it was abandoned. My grandfather claimed it. Growing up, I heard this was a wealthy family's house, evidenced by the fact that they left behind an entire trunk full of chocolates. Now the house is partitioned in 2 as my grandfather lies weak, ill and dying, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, in a room in a part of the house that 2 of his 7 sons live in. The other half is occupied by another son. The son split the house in 2, and the partition was not amicable. The brothers fought over portions of the house, each feeling cheated out of his fair share. And the 3 who claimed the house, 2 in one section and 1 in the other, screwed their remaining siblings, including my mother, out of their rightful claim over a house the family barely had a claim over to begin with. I'm not sure how old I am in this scene. Maybe I'm 5. The white-bearded, light-skinned, frail man on the bed, my grandfather, is dying. Some people are weeping, speaking in hushed tones. There is a sense of great importance in the room. Something is about to happen. I'm not there when it does. I'm told that just before he died, he smelled blossoms, asking, "Where are all these flowers coming from?" There were no flowers in the room. This is a good sign. The smell of flowers means he is headed to Jannah, the garden, paradise, encountering its smell before its sight. He smelled heaven while still alive, in the liminal space between life and death, when he could still communicate, when he could still tell us, "There are flowers in paradise, I smell them." The next time I see him, he is dead, his washed body lying on a charpai. There is a huge slab of ice the size of a coffin underneath the charpai, cooling the body from below so it doesn't rot. The body, the charpai, the coffin-sized block of ice are all in the courtyard of the house. I think it's summer, an early evening, so likely about 7 p.m. Some of the adults are wailing. My mother's sister brings me close to the body. "Go ahead, look at him. He's your nana, your grandfather, your mother's father." The words for maternal and paternal grandfather are different in Urdu, nana and dada, respectively. The difference between these grandfathers is significant. You have different claims over each. They have different kinds of power over you. Go ahead, look at him. He's your nana. Even now, as I remember or manufacture this scene, I am aware that she means to convey something important to me, but I don't get it. Not then, not now. What is she trying to tell me? Maybe she wants me to know where I'm from, my maternal lineage. Maybe she's just overcome with grief, and this encounter has nothing to do with me. That's more likely. This is about her. But I don't know that when I'm 5. And more than 30 years later, I remember that exchange, but I doubt she has any recollection of it. I go into a dark back room off the courtyard, crossing into another section of the house, and hang out with my cousins who are also children. We discuss, try to process what has just happened and how we should behave. Our grandfather just died, says one cousin. We should be sad, says another. Let's cry, suggests a third. Good idea, we agree. So we try to make ourselves cry, mimicking the adults, forcing feelings of sadness I don't actually feel. After all, I never had a relationship with this man who has just died. This man named Asadur Rahman. Beautiful name when you think about it. Not the Lion of God, but the Lion of the Merciful. A name that holds opposites, that imagines fierceness and mercy together at once. As I think back on this strange memory of being in a dark room that feels like a cave, the walls made of stone and brick, moisture seeping through them so the room feels damp, pretending to be sad, fake crying at the death of a grandfather I never knew, I wonder, is this the first memory I have of feeling like a fraud? I wonder too, can grief be stolen? What I'm really asking is, can grief be owned? There is a contested story about the British East India Company involving the thumbs of Bengali weavers. According to oral accounts, the thumbs of Bengali weavers were cut off by the British to prevent them from competing with the East India Company in the textile trade. But a written account by a colonialist himself states that the East India Company's labor practices were so horrific that Bengali weavers cut off their own thumbs rather than allow their labor to be stolen by the British. Where does the truth of the missing thumbs lie? In the oral history of indigenous peoples or the written history of colonizers? Memories too, it turns out, can be stolen. In the episode of the hatchet, I was never physically hurt. The mere threat of violence was enough to put the fear of God in me. The fear of God can be more merciful than the fear of the state. God can be shaped and reshaped by us, but we are helpless before the state. And it worked. I learned the lesson I was supposed to, that people and things can be owned, that some people own more things than others, that ownership is virtuous, and even more, it is a protected right. Taking something that someone else claims ownership over is called theft. It does not matter how little you have or how much they have, or how they came by what they have. Taking it is a crime and a sin. The crime is both moral and legal. Laws, religious and secular, punish the thief. The punishment is often physical, whether it involves cutting off a hand or confining you to a cage, stealing years from your life. I learned this lesson living on stolen land stolen by Europeans from the indigenous peoples whom they mistook as Indians and then called Indians anyways. Stealing their identities, their names, their land, their kin, their children, their language. Teaching us that what is not owned can still be stolen. So the lesson I learned was this: the powerless have only a merciful God to rely upon, whereas the powerful can rely on the mercy of the state.
Thank you so much, Ayesha, for your reading. It was very, very impactful. One second. So before we jump into our dialogue with questions, I want to kind of begin with by opening up the description of the book, where I think many of us are being introduced to your text. So I want to say this isn't a book about a Muslim woman's choice to no longer wear the niqab. It's also not about the time your parents joined an Islamic cult, or that time that an evil auntie locked you in a closet with a dead lobster to scare you into never talking too much ever again. I mean, yes, these are stories you share in the book and are traumatic experiences you went through to arrive at your truths. However, the narrative structure of this book isn't one of reclamation, in which a main character shores up the salvageable parts of her faith, her family stories, and her culture. The story that you share doesn't follow this white supremacist or even heteropatriarchal Islamic redemption arc of a woman being saved from her religion, her parents, or her impurity. Nor is this a story about you saving yourself from all the racial, religious, and gendered trauma. So I see this book really as a constellation of many multiple stories, and they're all occurring in different timelines. You begin the book with this heartbreaking loss of your beloved nephew, Sibkatullah, and after whom you've named this book, and you end this book with his burial. It is a practice of embodied theory. Each story has a purpose and it comes with social commentary. And I personally read it as a story in which the ways in which grief lays us all bare and unravels us to our very core. So it's a way of you revisiting the pivotal and banal moments in your life that shaped your moral education and examining the colonial, racialized, and gendered conditions under which you and your loved ones had to make some very difficult decisions. So I want to really begin our dialogue with asking more about your narrative voice in this text. And with this question, so was there a feeling, event, or conviction that compels you to sit and write these stories down? And can you give us a bit of insight into the work that went into nurturing this narrative voice?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that description as well. I think in many ways, this was a story that people told me all my life when they would learn a little bit about me, they would say, you should write a book about your life. And it was a book that a lot of people had told me I should write, but it was also a book that I never ever intended to write. I'd always be like, no, I'm an academic, I don't write those kinds of books. And I wasn't really interested in writing this book. And then when I was in 2015-16, I got a fellowship at Radcliffe. And it was a really special time because, I had just I had just gotten tenure, which means that I had just finished graduate school and then had been an assistant professor and worked nonstop really until I got tenure. And so it was just like, there was like a capaciousness in that time. There was time to think, there was time to, just sort of contemplate and reflect on one thing at a time. So it was a beautiful gift, that fellowship. And right in the beginning of that fellowship, within the first couple of weeks, I found myself sitting on the patio outside the building that we had our offices in because the sun was shining and I didn't want to be in front of a computer screen. And at the time I was supposed to be writing this article that was eventually published in the Oxford Handbook of Islamic Law called Islamic Legal Studies, a Critical Historiography. And I thought, I'll go outside, I'll take some notes, I'll think about what I want to write about. And I sat outside and then I found myself writing something, and that something became the first chapter of the book. And it really it came through me. I don't feel like I intended to write it. I don't feel like, it was not intentional. It was just something that my body that needed to come out of me, and it emerged, and I was writing it with a pen and a paper. It was a very moving experience, even for myself. And I actually cried when I was writing it. And when I called my partner my partner Rumi, who was at Stanford at the time. And I asked him, I said, I've written something. It's really, I don't know what it is. Can I read it to you? And he was taking a walk. He said, that's perfect timing. And I read it to him and he was like, I've never heard that voice from you before. Like, I don't know what this is, but he encouraged me to keep going. And then over the course of the year, I continued writing and I continued sharing the work with my fellows, with friends. And I received really positive feedback, and everyone just sort of encouraged me to continue going. And I tell that story in particular because it wasn't just important that I had some time to think and that I could write and that I could trust myself to continue writing, but I only trusted myself because there were people around me who loved me, who were willing to lend a kind ear, who were willing to see what I was doing and who encouraged me to continue going. So in so many ways, this book was written in community, and I don't think it could have really materialized without community. And one of the things I think that happens in academia through education, the way that we're educated, is that even though everyone talks about finding your voice, I think often so many of the ways that we teach, we actually teach students to, and we teach each other to actually silence our voices and not hear ourselves. So we're cut off from ourselves, from our own questions. And so when we do hear our voice, it can feel I think about, like, I don't know, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but I'm also just dating myself because I have white hair. But you know, when I was growing up, we didn't have iPhones and the kind of technology that we have now, and it wasn't like commonplace to hear your voice recorded. So the first time you would hear your voice recorded, I think, I don't know what other people's experiences were, but I know that it's a common experience to hate your voice when you first hear it, or just be sort of unsettled by it, or maybe not love it immediately. And so I think of that as a kind of metaphor for when you finally hear your voice in your writing, it can be a really disconcerting and unsettling experience. And you have to sort of negotiate that. You have a complicated relationship around that. And I think that's where community comes in and is really important to help you cultivate and hold space for that voice.
Yeah, I think the hatred of the voice, it comes from like who you're also talking with and speaking to. So if you're speaking with a very like a white reader who's very ungenerous and has some toxic ways of reading the text or reading your comments, then you tend to hate yourself in that mirror. So my next question would be, in this book, one of the most powerful things you do is that you directly speak with the audience. Your audience is your mother, your audience is your grandfather, your audience is your partner, and sometimes your audience is your younger self and you roast her, and other times you are very tender with her and critical also, right? So it's really interesting to see you addressing relationships, your past selves, and also calling yourself to account for some past ways of being, right? So my other question is, while you were writing this book, was there an intended reader or an intended audience in your mind as you wrote it? A loving audience, perhaps? And the other big question is, who is this book for?
That's such a good question. Yes, I was, you know, in publishing, there's this idea that I've encountered anyways, that, you know, you're supposed to, if a book is going to be really popular, you should write for like the housewife in Kansas, who like is a mythical character because she's like spends her afternoons or days reading books. But that's not who I was thinking about. I was definitely thinking, I think it's like so important that you know that that you hear me talking to a younger version of myself, because I was very much writing to a younger version of myself. And I wasn't writing a book for her that she would necessarily love and just be like, okay, great, awesome. I was writing a book she was going to struggle with. And so that was really important to me to do that. And, you know, Toni Morrison says this thing about, you should write the book that you want to read. And, you know, we so rarely we so rarely see ourselves reflected in stories. We're absent from stories in which we were there, or like, so we're like erased or in various ways. Or when we are represented, we're often represented in a very politicized, dehumanized way. We're uncomplicated characters. We're either monstrous or we're really submissive. And so I was really hungry for more stories of us. I still am hungry for that. And by us, you know, I mean, that's the other question, is like, who is the we, who is the us that I was writing to? You know, I was thinking about us as Muslims, as South Asians, as women, as first generation immigrants, people in diaspora, people living in the colonial nation states, and having complicated relationships, like thinking about what that means. People thinking seriously about home as a place where you can lose and find yourself, and what does it mean to assume that you have the right to have a home, is a question that I'm really curious about in the book as well. So those are some of the audiences. Those are some of the ways to think about audience.
Okay, sorry, the internet went weird. So this question of, all right, so the thing in your book is you're representing a lot of intimate stories. There's stories about family intergenerational traumas. There's stories that are very much bodied and require a trusting reader. And when we're doing that work of decentering whiteness and trying to our best to not imagine a white reader, the thing is we're still putting our intimate stories, our family stories, into the public gaze. So my next question is, how does decentering whiteness in our storytelling practice impact how we represent our parents, homelands, and traditions in our stories? What kind of responsibilities do we have as witnesses, carriers, and keepers of our family stories? And the reason why I ask this is that as Muslim immigrants, we don't get to represent our family members, our deen, our communities as being just as messy as everything else in the world. So any contestation or conflict that we have becomes like this huge clash of civilizations. And then we have this anxiety of misrepresenting our ummah, or also being read as backwards, or inferior, or worse, being read as haram, right? So because of this fear, we censor ourselves and how we represent our truths, and then the way that we tell our stories looks different.
Right. Yeah, that's a beautiful question, and like, thank you for your thinking, your deep thinking around that question as well. It's such a good question. Like, how do you decenter whiteness in your writing? And I feel like when I hear that question, it's a really good question. And I'm also thinking at the same time, one of the things I wonder about is, what is the question behind that question? Mm-hmm. And I think that the question, one of the answers that I have for that, for the question behind that question is, how do we write as if we love ourselves? Right? How do we love ourselves, which is like the deeper question there too. Because one of the things that I think systems of domination do, whether it's like heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, class, thinking about all of these different forms of domination, is that, their scripts about us end up taking up residence in our bodies. So they end up, sitting in our hearts and in our minds. And when we see through the eyes of that system of domination, right? We see and we hear through it. And then when we speak, we often find ourselves repeating the scripts of us that system is teaching us. And so instead of talking about our own truths. And I think, so it is really important to decenter these systems that sort of give us these very flat, one-dimensional ways of understanding ourselves. And so I tried to cultivate certain techniques of writing. So one of the things I did was, I didn't want to answer the questions of white supremacy or patriarchy around the hijab or around the story of my life. I didn't want to answer their questions. I didn't want to consider their frame. But that's a practice that you have to cultivate, both like in your own thinking and in community. So one of the ways that I did that was that I tried to approximate as much as possible the voice in my head. So I was sort of like, how can I like see that voice reflected on the page? And that voice is a multilingual voice. So it speaks sometimes in English mostly, but then sometimes it speaks in Urdu and in Arabic as well. And when it doesn't translate it all the time. So I tried to capture that. And one of the beautiful things about publishing with One World was that they did a really beautiful job with the book. Like, the cover is gorgeous. There's shiny stuff on there. They also, we were able to have Arabic and Urdu script in the book as well, which felt like a soft landing place. It was really beautiful. The other thing is that I tried to write, I really enjoyed writing in a non-linear way. I love books that are written in a non-linear way. And I also just embraced repetition, like telling a story, the Quran does that actually. The Quran will tell the story of Moses and it'll tell it like 7 times or multiple times. And then each time you get a different perspective, or you get different details, or like something just a little bit different. And it makes you think about the story more deeply. So I try to embrace repetition, even though usually we're taught like not to be redundant and etc. for the sake of efficiency. I also, really did try to think about my audience when I was making an argument. I was like, who am I talking to? And why would they be interested in listening to me? Why would they feel compelled to listen to me? So like, if you're speaking to Muslims and you're making an argument about, theology, or you're thinking about Islamic law, well, you want your audience to actually, feel like they can come along with you and that they want to come along with you. So they feel compelled to do so. So I was thinking about like clearly, so at moments about the audience. Sometimes I would feel like I think like the most important thing, actually, I should back up a little bit about this question, is recognizing that we're formed by the systems that we resist. So like white supremacy, patriarchy, class, like all of those things live in our bodies and they are inside of us. So like, I think recognizing that is really important as well. So like, and recognizing that allows us to think like, when are we reproducing those scripts? And there were times in the book when I felt like I just couldn't get the gaze of whiteness out of my head. And so then I just would address it. I'd be like, just want to say the story I'm telling is not what you think I'm doing. There's a different story, or maybe you're reading it in this way, but can you consider thinking about it in this other way? So I would address it. And then it was also in terms of my imagined audience, I was thinking about an audience that had loving, kind, and tender ears, and I think actually we were in a conversation, and I believe it was Jordan who was telling me, who's reminding me of this thing that we say in the academy, where it's that, when we teach students how to write, we say, like, professors will often say, imagine your audience as someone who is like lazy, hostile. What is that? Lazy, hostile, lazy, stupid, and hostile. And so I'm not interested in talking to that person. So I'm not interested in writing to that person. And so it was really nice to imagine someone who was actually interested in listening and who was kind, who would give me the benefit of the doubt, who would just be nice. It was nice to do that. And one of the ways I think that I was able to cultivate that was to write in community. So I was always sharing my work and the various versions of the manuscript I had with friends and people that I respected deeply, my friends who I respected deeply. And because, I think that, unlearning the scripts that we're raised with is not just a cerebral process. It's a process, like, we get all of these messages, so we have to replace them with other messages around us, so that our hearts can change, our eyes, we can change the way we see, we can change the way we hear. And so that was an important part of that. And yeah, so I'll stop there.
The cool part for me is that, like, you were that loving and caring reader for my PhD dissertation as my supervisor. And then when I was reading your text, I was practicing and mirroring the same way of reading that I really learned from you. And what I'm so excited for is when people read this book, especially Muslim women, they're going to also be kind of mimicking and mirroring the same language that you use to talk about yourself. And that's a language of self-love, right? And being forgiving of ourselves and some of the decisions that we made in the past, some of the self-hatred that we might have carried, like, all of that self-love and that narrative voice that you put so much labor into building for yourself. Muslim women who read this book are also going to be learning that moral vocabulary and that language to advocate for themselves. So I think it's really cool. Okay, so now that we're talking about narrative, voice, and form, the next big set of questions is on place and the situatedness of knowledge. So one big theme that I kept seeing across chapters or stories was the centrality of land. So your practice of embodied theory is very, very relational, and it's also very situated in place. You invite readers into your mother's childhood home in Gujranwala, Pakistan, to your parents' home in Mississauga, and to your nephew's gravesite, into some very, very intimate and raw moments. So although the violence of partition, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy work together to displace you from the lands upon which your story is unfolding, your closing words of your book remind us that we're of this earth, that we all will return to this earth. There's this beautiful imagery of return and restoration. So this language of land and return is then mirrored in your book with this language of returning to our mothers. There we go. So much of this book is you jumping through time to run into your mother, to hold your mother, to protect your mother against all of the forces that endanger her life. So I was wondering if you can share with us more about the place of land in your storytelling practice and also within Islamic cosmology.
I love that question. That's a really, really beautiful question. And there's a lot in there. So I'm probably not going to address all of it, but if I miss something, we can carry on. Like, you can ask me a follow-up question and we can get there. But I think one of the things I love about embodied theory, which is what I think of this book as, is that it must be relational. It must be situational. Like, it grounds you in a community. It grounds you in who's doing the writing, who's doing the thinking, what kinds of relationships are they in with the people around them and with the spaces around them. So it really draws our attention to that. So I feel like, I wonder if that's just like a character of embodied theory, that's why I ended up doing that. And in terms of Islamic cosmology, I think there were two ideas that I don't talk about directly in the book, but that I actually really love. And I think they really form some of the ways that I think about the world. And they're the ideas in Islam of tawbah and of taqwa. And they're repeated over and over again in the Quran. So taqwa is an idea, there's a word that is so difficult to translate. People usually translate it as like God-fearing or but it's a much more complex word than a word that's much more complex than that meaning. So someone asked, I think it was Umar, the Prophet's companion, Umar, someone asked him, what does taqwa mean? And he says it's like you're walking through a passage where there's like thorny bushes on each side of you, and you have a cloak around you, and you pull the cloak really close so it doesn't snag into the thorns. But there's understanding that you're always going to be snagging into the thorns anyways. And so what I love about that idea is that there's this understanding of complicity. Like you don't get to not walk through the thorns and not snag, but you try your best to curtail the level of complicity that you have in the things around you. And the thing that I love about Toba, like, one of the meanings that it can have is the idea of return. And in Islam, there's this idea, like in Islamic tradition, there's this idea of that humans are born in a state of fitra, in a state of nature. And we're always trying to return. We're trying to do Toba. We're trying to return to that state of nature. So it's very different than the Christian idea of the original sin, where you're born with sin and then you're trying to move away from it. It's more like it's a more circular motion. It's like a kind of return, but it's a return that never is going to happen. So it's like it's always an attempt at a return. And God is described in the Quran as Tawwab Rahim, as someone who, sort of like makes space for that returning, is the one who accepts the returner. So there's this relational way of thinking about it. And I love that idea. And I think that one of the lies of Puritanism, and I do think of white supremacy and patriarchy, heteropatriarchy as kinds of Puritanisms, is that we can be pure, that we can be sinless, that we can be, we can achieve a space of like moral cleanliness. And that if we walk through this, either that we don't have to walk through the thorns at all, or if we do walk through them, it's possible not to get snagged, that you can do it without getting snagged. And the other lie, I think, of these systems of Puritanism is that individuals can solve larger systemic problems. And so I feel like those were some ideas that I was really thinking about throughout the book that are really important to me. And I was thinking about, some of the things that, that neoliberalism does is that it makes us feel like individuals are responsible for larger systemic problems. And I think one of the ways that that expresses itself is with this need, and we were talking about this earlier, about how we're made to feel like we have to save our parents somehow. But the thing is, like, we can't save our parents. That's like one of the greatest sorrows of all of this, is that we can't how could we save them from colonialism, from displacement, from the traumas that they've experienced? We really just can't do that. It's an unbearable burden, I think, that we're sometimes made to carry. And I think the sorrow of understanding that we can't do that and letting that go is really, really important. And maybe I think also one thing that I've been thinking lately, because of the conversations that we've had, is I wonder if like the idea of saving and saviorship itself is a neoliberal idea. Maybe that's the thing that we need to problematize as well, because in the Islamic tradition, you mentioned the word ummah earlier. We have this idea of community, and ummah is really a community. It's not a nation state. It's not, it's not a person for sure. It's not a race. It's not an ethnicity. It's not a class. It's actually a community. And maybe maybe if we think of saving, that we should think about it in terms of community, that we can only be saved within the ummah. We can only be saved within community. And maybe saving is just like the wrong framework as well, is something I've been thinking as well lately. So maybe what we need to be thinking about is actually healing. Like, how do we heal ourselves and each other? And healing happens, again, through relationality, with our relationship to each other, to relationship to the earth. And this is a place where I think Indigenous thinking and wisdom can be a guide for us a little bit. I'm thinking of Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks so beautifully about what that means to be in relationship to the earth. And also I'm thinking about the poet Roske's work on where he thinks about joy. One of the ways that he thinks about joy is laying our sorrows together. And in that space, finding some sort of space for healing and comfort. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in relation to that.
Yeah, so this was a theme across the stories as well, this language of saving. Like you mentioned in this one point, you wish you could have saved, or you may have saved your younger sister from having to wear the niqab at such a young age, or you wish you could have saved your mother from this situation. A lot of this is like really like diasporic language of like, I wish my relations, my sister, my mother, and my grandmother doesn't have to go through the same pain that I went through. And it's something that I also think a lot about. Like, I have a baby now, and I'm like, I really don't want my baby to go through the same kind of racism that I went through in high school. But like, can I really save him from that? No. But if you look at healing, like, how can I build a nurturing relationship and foundation for this child to grow up and have a healthy sense of self? So there's protective love, but it's hard to get rid of the language of saving because we can't save others. And it's also very triggering colonial language of saving. Okay, so the next big section of questions is really about the body. So we've talked about place, we talked about relationships. Now let's get to the body. There's this huge section in the book called Hair Diaries that I think every Desi woman will relate to. It is about a lifelong struggle of really grooming your body, disciplining the body, trying to make it presentable to the white gaze. And it's all about hair removal, the ways that we do our hair, all of that. And it's about the politics of desirability, right? But there is this sad argument that made me feel sad throughout the text that, listen, you can do everything you can. You can make yourself desirable. You can, get laser hair skin removal. You can wear the niqab and cover every inch of your body, but you will still never protect yourself or be protected from the violence of heteropatriarchy, white supremacy. And there is a sense of betrayal that, as Muslim South Asian daughters, we're raised to be, chaste, pious, obedient, sacrificial daughters. But when you grow up, you realize that you can do everything right by these books or these checklists, but you're not saved from abusive marriages or the settler colonial stage or displacement. So there's this what a lot of Muslim women think about is that when so much pressure is put on our bodies about this concept of izzat and maintaining the honor of the home, what happens is that the boundary between our bodies and the world is totally blurred, and this is a violation of our sovereignty, right? So moral order depends on our individual choices, how we dress ourselves, how we groom ourselves. And there's these stories in your book where you talk about how deeply you feel for other people's pain, and you internally possess another person's pain just by witnessing it, right? And I wonder whether this intense possession of another person's pain or grief in our bodies as Muslim women comes a little bit from being made to feel that the world's moral order is on our bodies and our choices. So on one hand, it's a great thing because it heightens our capacities as witnesses, right? But then it also there's no boundaries of how much we feel and take on ourselves. And then this language of the sacrificial caregiver comes in. So just what are your thoughts on this connection?
That's a really beautiful connection, and it's something that I'm just thinking about as you're talking about it. There's a lot to think about there in relation to that. One of the things that when you were talking, I was thinking about was W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, about when you're when he's talking in the context of African Americans. When you're an oppressed minority, you have this your own version of what you're experiencing, and then you also have this gaze of the oppressor's perspective on what you're experiencing, and you're carrying those at the same time. I'm probably not describing that concept appropriately, but I'm just, for this conversation, let's just go with that at this moment. And so but this idea of having two gazes, carrying two gazes at the same time, one of which is a hostile gaze, is an experience that a lot of people who are not white and who are not male have in this world, right? And the reason that they have that is because that's how we survive. We actually, it's a survival skill. And so I think that negotiating those two gazes within ourselves, two or more gazes that we have within ourselves, is part of it's part of the sorrow, I think, of being in a system and being at the crosshairs of various systems of domination. And I think the book does explore how the scripts that are set out for us that are meant to save us actually usually are the ones that sink us. And that Hair Diaries chapter is what's one of my favorite chapters. And it was the chapter where you get in the book and you're just all the conversations about hijab and niqab have not been about that necessarily at all, right? And so that was an interesting thing too, to be able to take the veil, which is turned into a symbol and is given all this static meaning, depending on where you are in that conversation, whether you're a French legislator trying to ban the niqab or a veil, or whether you're a Saudi cleric who's saying that it's mandatory. What was interesting about the book, as a person who had worn both the hijab and the niqab for decades, it was interesting to just sort of take away all of that meaning. And again, thinking of those symbols in an embodied way was a thing that was unsettling, unsettled, and move like the fixedness of those meanings. So when, when ideas are sort of like abstracted away from the human, they can become dehumanizing. And I think that one of the ways that I think about that in the book is through these scripts of Puritanism, these various kinds of Puritanism, that if you do this, you'll become clean and pure. But I think like the problem isn't that like, that if you do this is wrong. The problem is that actually, what is the pure that we're trying to get to? What if we're already here?
It makes me think of that one line in your book that, it makes you sad that you spend all this time. It makes you sad that you spend all this time like grooming your hair and removing and lasering, when really the fact that our body hair grows means that we're alive. And I just like stopped to really think about that. And I was like, she's right. Like, this is a big deal that we have body hair. But yeah, it's the little things.
Yeah.
So the last two questions. So the one question is, so what kind of anxieties did you feel about writing about veiling in the niqab? Because it's a big archetypal topic in Muslim feminism, but also what do you want readers to take away from your commentary on it?
From my commentary on the veil.
Mm-hmm. Or just veiling as a practice.
Right. Well, so, I never wanted to write about the veil. It's not like a thing that I was interested in writing about. And yet I was also frustrated that there was no narrative that I read about it that captured my experience of it. So I figured if it's not capturing my experience, it's probably not capturing other people's experience as well. And I am ideally suited to write about it, having worn it for decades. So I felt like in the end, it was an interesting way to think about my journey, like through the world, like to think about, being a child growing up in this place, because it was like this, it became this fraught site of contestation. And it was really actually interesting to like, strip it of its meaning and show how the meaning of the veil for me and for the people around me, depending on what situation I was in, what time period I was in, changed all the time. So, like, I'm a professor and my relationship to being a professor changes over time. It's not the same thing as it was when I started. So it's the same thing with the veil. Like, it doesn't mean one thing to me the whole time I wear it. Or when I take it off, it still doesn't mean the same thing to me over the years. And it doesn't mean the same thing to other people. So it's always a site of negotiation. It's always a site where various ideas are like, coming, like butting up against each other, sometimes like finding new ways around each other. So it was nice to write about it in this fluid and dynamic way where it actually did not have a fixed meaning anymore. And I think that thinking about it always like in an embodied way was the thing that gave me the ability to do that, facilitated that. Yeah.
Yeah, like in the book just itself, you talk about the veil as a target, a shield, a boundary, a site for cosmological collision, but connection, a mirror, a choice, an inheritance. There's just such a complexity to it, which is really important. And there's this really good chapter or story that everybody should look for in the book called Scripts, where you go really into that topic. All right, last big question before question period. Where are you today in relationship to these stories? So sometimes when we make a huge text, we read after it's produced, we read it after, and sometimes we feel cringe. Sometimes you feel really, really excited, like, wow, I wrote that. I'm really proud of myself. And sometimes it's just sheer joy, like I did it, right? So how do you feel about what you have written? And how has your narrative voice grown since completing and publishing this book?
Great question. I feel like I wrote it's not been that long since I wrote the book, so there hasn't been that much time to grow. I've grown a little bit though, I hope. But I feel like, so I don't feel cringy about any part of the book yet. I mean, maybe there'll come a time where I will. I feel mostly joy about having written it. And the responses that I've gotten, the book came out in April in the UK. I've received some beautiful notes and beautiful messages where people have told me the kind of movement or work that it has done in their own lives, or the things that it has helped them see, and that feels really important and really, really beautiful and really, really good. I think that I'm trying in my life to be softer, and one of the things I think that Puritanism does, whether it's like we're thinking about heteropatriarchy, whether we're thinking about white supremacy, whether we're thinking about forms of Islam. One of the things that Puritanism does, the worship of the pure does, whether it's like a formal religion that we follow or it's, an ethic or an attitude that we have, is that it hardens us. It like makes us become defensive, and it makes us not want to be open to new ideas. It wants us to so it hardens us. And I think hardening ourselves, that's a very reasonable thing to do when you're trying to survive. but it's not the thing that you can do when you need to thrive, when you want to thrive. So like if you think of if you think of a seed, like a seed is hard and it can survive centuries actually. And it's hard, but then in order for it to thrive, it has to like break open and it has to like let itself, like a very, very soft and breakable part of it has to emerge in order for it to become something else. And so that's the practice I'm trying to engage in, which is like becoming softer. And I think when you're softer, you're able to pay attention to more beauty. Actually, you're able to like give consideration to that more so than you would otherwise. And so I think that there are parts of the book that if I wrote, I wonder if I would, if I wrote now, like if I wrote the book now, it would be a different book because I'm a different person. But I feel like there's parts of the book I wonder, oh, like if I wrote it now, would I write that sentence a little softer, or would I think of that idea a little softer? So one of the things I do in the book, in the hair diaries, for example, is I talk about my white or gray hair. And I was thinking the other day, oh, like the moon was out, it was a beautiful evening, I was taking a walk and I was thinking, oh, the word for silver in Urdu is chandni, and the word for moon is chand. So like chandni means moonlit. So the word for silver is kind of like moonlit. And I was thinking, oh, I wonder if I would have written about my hair like that, I would have written about it being moonlit, which is such a different, it evokes such a different emotional response. When you think about like hating moonlit hair, it's so different than hating gray hair. I just sort of an interesting. So sometimes I have like thoughts like that, like, oh, well, I wonder what I would have done with that.
No, but those kinds of thoughts, they're so small, but they really come from somewhere else. Maybe it's like future Ayesha talking to you, but they're coming from somewhere. And the point is to cultivate that energy. So many people, including myself, one of our biggest prayers is like, this world is tough. There's full of hardship. I just pray that like my heart continues to keep softening and remain soft and I don't get hardened based on what life throws at me. So I really appreciate that. I'm looking now at the time. We're at perfect timing. So if everybody who has a question, you're welcome to put it into the Zoom chat and also into the Facebook chat. So if you want to take maybe 2 to 3 minutes of doing that. And then to start off question period, I have a question. It's not from me, it's from somebody who messaged me. It's from Zenith from Columbia College. So her question was, what role do you think your book plays in really decolonizing academia? So you're, as a professor, when you write in this way, what are you doing when it comes to decolonizing the way that we produce knowledge?
That's a big question. That's a good big question. I have a question. I do have a question, actually. It's genuinely a question about the word decolonization. Like, I wonder if it's possible to decolonize anything. Like once colonialism has happened, can we really undo it? Like, maybe we make something else, but I wonder if you can de the thing. You know what I mean? So I just want to raise that. I want to raise that as just as a question. Like it's a word that does, whenever I hear it, I'm like, what? We can't really, it's like a kind of a turning back in time that feels like is impossible. But so having said that, I think that, one of the things I mentioned the article that earlier, Islamic Legal Studies, a Critical Historiography. In that article, I was basically like trying to understand like what my problems were with the discipline of Islamic studies, the way that it works right now, the dominant forms of Islamic studies that I had encountered. And I was trying to think about what would it look like to not do Islamic studies in that way. And then this book came, basically, like I was writing it at the time, and then, but like, so much of the thinking that came in the final version of this book flows from that article. So that article it's a good article. I like it. It's a useful one to consider as you're thinking about what I'm doing in this book or what I'm trying to do in this book. And I think the most important piece is embodied theory, right? So it's this idea that when theory gets abstracted from tangible experiences and people's lived lives, that's when it's really easy for it to become cerebral. It's easy for it to become dehumanized and dehumanizing. And it's easy for it to worship a certain kind of puritanism, because when ideas are abstracted from people, it's really easy to have neat categories that and stable ideas that feel grounded, but actually are not when they confront the lived experience of real lives. And so, this book is doing a lot of thinking around ideas that we consider in the academy around gender and Islam. I'm thinking about the theology of death. I'm thinking about Islamic law. I'm thinking about how race works. I'm thinking about class, but I'm not doing it in like a jargony way. I'm trying to root it in an embodied experience, and hence the storytelling. And storytelling, telling stories is how we survive, actually. That's partly what I was thinking about as well. I think when we tell stories, we're building an archive, and we're also sharing laughter and joy and knowledge. And if we don't tell our stories, we don't know how to learn from like the people who are around us, who have walked these paths before us, what they have learned. So it's really, really an important way, I think, to share knowledge. And there's a reason why scriptures are full of stories, by the way, because they're such an ideal way to communicate information. And so I was trying to like get us to think in more open, more accessible ways in the academy about and think about, Indigenous scholars say this all the time, like thinking about different ways of knowing. And so I was trying to contribute to that in a small way. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have one question, one comment from Erika, which says, not really a question, but you both are giving my heart so much honsla. Thank you, Erika. And so this is a question from Sidra. They say, I really enjoyed how you delicately discussed Israr Ahmed, but I burst out laughing when I read about John Doe. I too was a fan of that very same John Doe as a teen. What made you speak about him anonymously? How do you see yourself in relation to him, as you are now a public intellectual and a scholar who can stand toe to toe with him and his robes? LOL.
Thank you for reading the whole question, including the LOL. I thought, in the earlier versions of the book, that his actual name was there. But as we were getting close to publication, and I was sort of making tweaks at the end, I felt like that saying his actual name was a distraction, because in many ways, like, well, my critique of him was not actually just about him. It was like he was performing the role of an archetype in that book, and so in the book. So I didn't want it to become a distraction. Actually, I didn't want his personality to become a distraction. In the end, I wanted to maintain like the argument that I was making without really making it about him. So I think many of us have John Does in our lives, have encountered John Does, and I wanted us to look for them, actually, and pay attention when we see them.
So we have a quick
John Doe. That word is just so great, that the word for an everyday man is like a white man's name, which I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, or John Smith, Jane Doe. You know how back in the day, like on TV, you would have those shout out messages where you would text and your friend's name would pop up. So we're gonna do that.
Okay. I don't know about that, but
no, it's a thing on music channels. But okay. We have a comment, not a question, from Simi Ghazi, and she says, Mubarak Ayesha on this stunning work, and thanks to both of you for such a deep, nuanced, and healing conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Simi.
So we're at 5 p.m. So should I do a last call for questions before our prayer? I have a question. Do you have a sequel?
I do have, like, I'm working on a couple of books right now, but I feel like I'm just like also listening and reading and thinking and paying attention to like letting things into me, because I want to like think and grow before I write more. I want to learn from this experience too. Yeah.
So shall we do our prayer then?
Yeah. So, one of the things I wanted to do a prayer, because we're right now having this conversation, as we said, as we acknowledged earlier, on stolen, unceded land. We are living in a time where, in the wake of slavery, in the wake of colonialism, in the throes of a kind of capitalism that is so destructive, we're in a global pandemic. There's a migration crisis that we are living through, that people are suffering deeply in. And also we're recently, right now, at the moment, also witnessing the sins of the settler colonial state in Palestine. And so, and in our own country that we're in right now, in Canada, there are dozens of Indigenous communities that do not have access to reliable, clean drinking water. So I wanted to end with a prayer that to acknowledge all of this. And this prayer is it's like a verse from the Quran, actually, that I'm just going to recite. And the verse basically says, what is wrong with you that you don't fight for the oppressed men, women, and children who are crying out, "Oh Lord, deliver us from this land of oppression. Appoint for us a friend, appoint for us a helper." So, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وما لكم لا تقاتلون في سبيل الله والمستضعفين من الرجال والنساء والولدان الذين يقولون ربنا أخرجنا من هذه القرية الظالم أهلها واجعل لنا من لدنك وليا واجعل لنا من لدنك نصيرا. Thank you everybody for being here. And I hope to be in touch with you all soon.